Hi, everybody. Welcome to ANN In Depth. Sam and I are here together for
Hi.
one since the beginning of the summer. We're so happy to be here. Today, we are having a very important conversation because End It Now Sabbath is this coming Sabbath, August 28th. And we talked to Rene Drumm, who is one of the leading researchers on abuse in the church. And we talked to her about some of her studies that she has done. And we talked to her about some of the resources that are available and how pastors and church members can help with abuse. Sam, what do you think
Yeah,
about our
before
conversation?
before people pause this video or step away, just think of this. You may not be in a relationship of where abuse is present, and thank God if that's the case. But you may have a friend who comes to you. So this conversation is incredibly important for you to be ready when that happens. What should you do if somebody shares that information with you? How can you really help them? What are the things you should avoid in not hindering even worse a situation that is already bad? Right now in this episode, we're very excited with this conversation.
Right. And I'm going to say this a lot throughout the episode, and I'm going to say it now. If you are looking for resources for End It Now, enditnow.org, enditnownorthamerica.org, please go. They have tons of resources where you can look things up. Rene provides some resources. So we really, I'm asking you to watch this episode and to, like Sam said, make sure you're ready when somebody comes to you and maybe confides in you that they're being abused, or if you are being abused, or if you are an abuser, there's advice for you as well. So we ask you to stay and watch the following episode. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Welcome to ANN In Depth. I'm so happy, Rene, that you're joining us this week. And Sam, you and I are finally back in the same episode after 6 weeks apart. So this is amazing. We're going to have a very important conversation this week because August 28th is End It Now Sabbath. And End It Now is the Adventist Church's program to highlight and bring abuse awareness. This program is airing on August 23rd. So people have a week to watch and to go to the End It Now website, enditnow.org, or which has tons of resources for End It Now Sabbath. But Rene, you have done one of the biggest studies that has been done on End It Now and abuse within the Adventist Church. And I was wondering if you could first start us off by talking to us about some of this research that you have done.
Sure. I'll be happy to do that and share what I found. First of all, there were 3 studies. The first one, and probably the one that you're talking about, was a regional study that was funded by a private family foundation. And that family was located in the Northwest Pacific area of the US. And so they asked us to start there. And so it was the North Pacific Union where we did that regional study. And we surveyed 49 churches, and we had 1,341 respondents. We went mostly in person to those churches. And it was a family life professional who gave a sermon, a small sermon. First of all, of course, we had to get the permissions from the higher ups in the union, and that's a whole other story if you want to ask about that again. But we contacted the pastors, and of course the pastors needed to agree as well. And then we took a Sabbath, and it was a family life professional who went to the church and gave a small sermon, a shorter sermon. And then at the end of the sermon, we asked, okay, instead of picking up an offering where we're asking for money from you, we are going to ask for even a bigger gift, and that is the gift of your time. And so if you could stay by afterwards, this is just for the adults, kids cannot participate. Men on one side, could you move over to this side of the sanctuary, women on this side of the sanctuary. And if you're willing to stay by and fill out this survey, we would so much appreciate it. And so it was geared towards adults 18 and older. And we asked specifically about behaviors that had happened in an intimate relationship.
Okay.
So not something that was their entire life, but just really for the first part, just focus on the time that you've either been married or living with someone or dating relationships. And so after people filled out the survey, we had a locked box with a slot that they could just put them in. And so the person that was presenting that day did not see their answers. Their spouse did not see their answers. The pastor did not. So it was a very safe environment for people to answer exactly what was going on with them. And from that survey with the 49 churches and over 1,000 respondents, what we did find was that the rates of abuse, physical abuse, were about on par with that of national studies. Actually, one of the fears of the North Pacific leadership at the time was that we'd find higher rates, because that was one theory that was around at that time, that it was the patriarchal systems or any kind of rigid adherence to beliefs that would actually bring up higher abuse rates. But we did not find that. It was about on par, a little higher for women, and definitely higher for men. And almost any study that you read about male abuse will say at the end a disclaimer like, we think that the rates are much higher than this, but we couldn't get a good sample. So I think that we succeeded where a lot of studies fall down, in that we had access and a safe place for both men and women to respond.
Nice. Well, not nice, but I mean, that sounds amazing. And I think that the other two studies, and we won't get into them, the one was done in an education setting. Is that right?
No, the other major study was a qualitative in-depth interview study.
Oh, okay.
Where we talked to over 40 women survivors who were Adventists, either at the time of their abuse. So what happened to you while you were attending church? Because a lot of victim survivors, after they go through such an abusive situation, they don't get the support that they need from their churches, and they give up on religion altogether. That was not the case for all of our victim survivors, the participants in our study, but there was a good portion that did leave. But the requirement was they had to be, again, over 18. They had to have been an Adventist during the time of their abuse.
One of the, as I was reading through, and Sam, I know you're going to be able to talk about this too. One of the, as I was reading through the article that you wrote in the Adventist Review, and we'll make sure we link to that, and on your blog, one of the things that I wish we did more, beyond, and we're going to talk about this, beyond talking about this on End It Now Sabbath or the week prior to it, and then sort of forgetting about it for the next year, is pastors training. And one of the things that you did, Rene, on your blog was you said you talked about things you wish pastors would say when people came to them abuse. I wish there was a way. And before this conversation, I said, even, the slightest, this is the least thing that can happen. But, as women, we're taught about using our intuition. And sometimes as women, I have said, oh, that person really made me uncomfortable. And someone will say, oh, it's just who they are. Don't feel uncomfortable. They're just that way. Which may be true, but it also may, my intuition may be telling me something. Sam, as a pastor, obviously you are a pastor. You have pastored local churches. So I gave you two examples before this. I told you I was going to ask you, if an elder came to you, because I think, let's start with that. If an elder came to you and said, hey, I'm being abused by my wife, how did you respond? I mean, and I'll ask you this, what I'm going to end up asking both of you is, do you wish you would have responded differently, or is this a great was this great for you? Did it work out?
It's actually, if a local pastor is willing to take this subject seriously, they're going to meet all sorts of stories and situations. And even in my 11 years in ministry, I have met a lot of this. In fact, for the first part of my ministry, it shocked me. That's the first part. People take about 2-3 years to trust you. And when they trust you, they share things that you never imagined. But after that, I realized the importance of an annual cadence of bringing this up. So once a year in my sermon planning, I would preach the same sermon every year on the sewage of the Old Testament, as the rabbis used to call it, which is Judges 19, that describes the priest and his, we don't know exactly, concubine, we don't know exactly what the relationship was, but it wasn't good from the outset. It was not his wife as the very law commanded. And then how the Benjamites, the whole story is terrible. In order for that story to reach the level of terrible and disgusting, it would need to improve considerably, because it is so bad. And I would preach on this very openly to say that it is possible that there are people listening here that are being abused at home or by other people in this very congregation or this community or in your local area. That is very possible that this is happening. And if it is happening, you don't have to suffer alone. And I would invite them to talk to us. First time I did it, it was not an annual thing the first time I did it, but when I preached on this, a couple of stories surfaced as people try to talk to me, and one of them came straight to me. The other told one of the elders that they were closest to, and the elder brought this up to me as the pastor. And both stories were horrifying. And one of them had one former elder and former pastor who was a member of my congregation, now retired, being inappropriate with touch during prayer. Right? So here is a spiritual leader that I would gladly give people to give Bible studies to, inappropriately touching this woman who came to tell me. Now, pastors that are in this situation, they will have many people come to tell them stories. In my experience, it is very important that you listen dispassionately to this. Because once you listen passionately and you become distraught or angry, or you show emotion as they are presenting it, they will either, in my experience, stop talking or step back and leave it at that, or they will exaggerate details that later they acknowledge they exaggerated. So because people have different personalities and they remember things differently. And it's important that you just listen to the story first and then you act. So I finished the sermon, we had lunch at the church, and then this lady talked to me. That very afternoon, I mentioned to a few elders and I took them with me, and we visited this former pastor now who was a member of my congregation. And together, we presented to him what was being said. What's interesting is this wasn't the first time. Other elders mentioned that there were other people beforehand who had stories similar to this, who they heard about. So when we came to him and said, this isn't the first time, and this happened. Now, I'm not a private investigator. And I'm going to ask you, and you're going to tell me. And you're going to tell me the truth. And we asked him. And he answered, yes, this happened. And then usually when there is somebody who did something that is unbiblical in one of my congregations, I generally ask them a very important question. Are you going to continue doing it, or was it a sin that you have asked God to forgive you and you're going to try your best not to do that again? Usually I do that. And if they say, well, I don't think it's that wrong, then I just ask them to write me a letter removing their membership from the local church. There's no impact to their fellowship. They still come. They're still part of that fellowship community, but they're no longer a member because they made a decision to live outside of biblical standards. If they say it's a sin, yes, I committed a sin, I ask God to forgive me, and I'm hoping that the church will forgive me too, then typically I ask them to write a letter saying that they're going to leave any office that they're holding, and they're asking not to participate in anything for a while, etc., etc. But in this case, this was a leader, and there are higher standards for leadership, biblical standards for membership and higher standards for leadership. So I mentioned to him that based on that, we would meet as a board, and it was very likely that he will be removed from fellowship. So in this case, that's exactly what we did. I think it took 1 week to meet as a board, and the next business meeting was already there. And within a very short space of time, within days, let's say, the pastor heard a story, confirmed it, brought to the elders, and it didn't matter that it was a very influential leader. The church took an action. And I was very worried from a reputation perspective, because everyone in the local community and other churches would hear about it. How would that lady feel? She wasn't even an Adventist. She was just receiving Bible studies, and this is how this guy was doing that. What would be the reputational impact to the church? And I was so surprised that the church and the community accepted this. There was no difficulty with the image of the church thereafter. And I learned a really important lesson. When you take these issues seriously, and I'll mention one later in the episode when we switch to children and pedophilia. When you act and you deal with it, like Israel did back with the Benjamites, the tribe of Benjamin was worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. And it took a lot of effort, but they dealt with it, and they, as far as we can tell, that sort of behavior stopped. It takes effort, but when you go through it, there is an increase in trust from people to the church, not a decrease in trust. And it alerted me to what you were saying, Rene. People are not surprised to know that in church there are those who abuse, right? It's not a surprise to anybody. There is no perfect church. Everybody knows this. In fact, if you find a perfect church, my advice to you is don't join it, because you're going to mess it up. So let's not fool ourselves that people think that those that go to church are perfect. No one thinks that. But what is expected of especially Christian communities is to act in the same way that Jesus would, which is to protect those that are being abused, and if necessary, to remove the danger when there is danger in any way. So in acting, obviously, in love. So that's one dimension, Jennifer, that I think is really important for us to, especially pastors, not to shy away from dealing with it according to the church manual. We have a whole church manual that outlines precisely what the best way is to deal with this. And the manual is being adapted and changed for decades. It's not something that came up last week and we came up with a document. No, it's being constantly perfected. So my suggestion is take the manual seriously and take these stories seriously and act on it.
Yeah, Sam, and I think, what you did, obviously there was a solution to it. You took the woman seriously, and then you acted on it. I think one of the struggles that I've read is, even in, as women, Rene, you mentioned, even as a woman, if another woman comes to me, I can be harmful too, and dismissive of another woman's abuse. If I'm running a women's ministries, if I'm running women's ministries in a church, or if I am a ministry leader, or if I'm just Jennifer in my local church and somebody feels like they can come to me and talk to me about this. And if that's the case, Rene, and Sam, if you have an opinion, I know you probably do, but what should be my response? Because here's the truth, is that I think a lot of times maybe the pastor isn't the first person that somebody who's being abused goes to. They don't think, let me go to the pastor. In fact, I think, Sam, you can corroborate this, and I think I'll say this correct, that actually elders are more influential or with members to some extent, or have more contact with members. They're more trusted in the Adventist church than pastors. And that was in a study that we did with archives. And I think David Trim has mentioned that before. So sometimes more likely that a woman will go to a pastor, or a man will go to a pastor. So Rene, what would you tell me to say? What are things that I should keep on my mouth, or what should I memorize when someone comes to me and says, hey, my husband, who may be influential in the church, or my boyfriend, who may be in seminary, or my wife, who may be the children's ministries leader, or just a member, I'm being abused. What should I think first? Okay, and what should I keep in my mind?
This is what we suggest in the trainings that we've done. 3 things. Number 1, I'm so sorry to hear that that's happened to you. I'm so sorry to hear that that's happened to you. And if you can repeat that and say that, it will come back to you at the time that you need it. And so that conveys a sense of that you believe the person, because the greatest fear of most victim survivors is to not be believed. So I'm so sorry that that's happened to you. Number 2, you do not deserve to be abused. Because already over and over, they've heard that the abuse is their fault. Oh, I wouldn't hit you except you gave me mayonnaise instead of salad dressing, or it was the wrong kind of mayonnaise, or you didn't fix me breakfast, and you didn't obey me when I said blah, blah, blah. So it's always victim blame. So you need to say something definite that it is not, the abuse is not their responsibility. It's the one that abused. It is their responsibility to stop. And it was their choice to abuse. So number 1, I'm so sorry that that's happened to you. 2, this abuse was not your fault, is not your responsibility. And 3 is probably the hardest one, because you need to offer something then. And that is, I have the number that you can call to get some help. In our trainings, we never try to make anyone an expert on domestic violence or spouse abuse. Instead, we encourage people to know what the resources are around them, and then help that person get the help that they need from professionals. So those 3 things.
So if I'm a local church, I attend a local church here in Maryland, in a little town, well, what used to be a little town in Maryland. I should be looking in my local community for what shelters we have, where women can go, or men can go to receive help, or counselor. I shouldn't try to, because I'm not a counselor, or not a therapist, or not an abuse expert, I should not help give advice, but show them where to go and have those resources available. Exactly. In the church office or something like that.
Perfect.
There are a few situations where a crime has been committed, and so for example, verbal abuse in a relationship, physical abuse in a relationship, sexual abuse in a relationship. Those are 3 layers And it is, if a crime has been committed according to local laws, it is important to point out that that the police may be a viable option. And most Western places have special police departments that deal with this directly. But it has to be a decision that the person makes. So I have in one instance, the church member pushed the victim, to go to the police. But it almost in a forceful way. It's like, no, this happened and you're going to report it and it doesn't matter. We're going to go and you're going to report it and it doesn't matter. And they were so filled with justice that they went to the police. And what happened is that the person later just backtracked their whole story because they were not ready for that yet. And it ruined an opportunity for real change and healing that would come after. So I don't know what Rene's opinion on this is, but it's also possible to try and do good and ruin the whole thing when you take away the control from the victim of what the next steps will be, because this is not trivial. It is to report abuse, it's either the end, it could lead to the end of a relationship or a new beginning in one way or another. And they've taken a while to come to you. So sensitivity is really important. Rene, I often wondered about the efficiency of those numbers in toilet cubicles, where you have, are you or someone struggling with abuse? Here's a number that could help. Because some people are in a private environment, so they feel, they could write down the number somewhere and so on. Is there anything about the efficiency of that?
I don't have any data on it, but it is something that is very commonly suggested, and in our trainings we've suggested that as well. So I would encourage anyone who has benefited from that to let us know in some way. Yeah, that was helpful. In one of our interviewees, she did mention that she had seen that, and she tore it off. It was just tiny, so it was something that she could put actually in her shoe. And then her husband didn't know that she had that number. And even though she didn't call it for a very long time, she did feel some sense of, if something happens, I have a number to call. So there was some security in that for her.
Yeah.
One of the, when you and I were in Romania, we went for the Total Member Involvement campaign, but I didn't preach. I was getting stories. And one of the systems they have, Adra House, which is in Romania, is a house. And Rene, you talk about women go back. This is something that you've had to learn, is that sometimes it takes 6 to 8 times of women going back to their abuser before it really clicks to leave. And Adra Romania has a ministry in Romania called Adra House, and they are what the women have to sign sort of this rule book. They went and they have to sign sort of this one that they will never divulge the location of this. There are 3 or 4 of them throughout Romania, and nobody knows where they are except for the police. They work with the police and these people who work there. And the second is that the women can't go back to their abusers. And once they go back to their abusers, then they cannot no longer be at the safe house, because then they know where it is. But I went with my colleague, Emily. And what was shocking to me is when we went into the door, there was a woman who had been obviously abused. I mean, she completely beat up. And apparently she looked much better than she had when she arrived. And she was able to get help through this FIT organization. And so this is an example in Romania. We have one in my town called Faith House that does the same kind of thing. So if you can find in your local communities these type of safe houses where women can go, and they can be protected. And then you have that information, like you said, in the stalls. I've seen them work really well. I've seen how they have protected women in these various locations. And our church work, we have members of our church who work with Faith House. And I think, Sam, like you've talked about I think they do provide support and help. They're not all of them Adventists, but at the moment a woman needs to get away from an abuser, that doesn't matter. You just want to get her safe. So yeah, I think if we could have those resources available in places where women can get them, like you mentioned, I have never thought, Rene, about even having a like a little thing that women can tear out and put into their shoe. That's something that people don't think about. So they're not writing it down, on their hand, but just like something little that people can take. Or if you notice that a friend of yours maybe you may suspect abuse among somebody you love or you care about, that you can take that and pass it off to them in a non-obvious way.
In
Go ahead.
many situations, the building of stereotypes is really detrimental to the end of abuse. And I think this is one of those cases. We have some stereotypes that we've created about the kind of man who abuses and the kind of women who are abused. So, and this makes it really difficult for someone who is suffering and struggling to even talk about it. For example, physical abuse is always a man, or is most often a man against a woman. And that is true. As far as we can tell, the data is pretty clear on that. And Rene, if I'm wrong, correct me. But there are also men who are consistently hit by their spouses, by their wives. And there is no way that a man would tell someone else, hey, my wife's beating me up. It's a really strong stigma on being beat up by his wife. Most men could, in a few seconds, stop the abuse, but they wouldn't dare hit a woman. They've been brought up right. They wouldn't do it. And yet, this seems to be the only desperate attempt from her, perhaps, to solve a conflict. So again, I've had one of those situations. The first time it happened, I went and I talked and I suggested they search for a counselor and they fix the problem. But in my experience, if it happens once, the chances of it happen a second time, a third time, a fourth time, a fifth, it's very difficult to break that trend. So the second time it happened, I said to this church member, I believe that there is a high probability that your marriage is over and you need to leave now and spend some time away before you decide to live together again. And this was a very difficult thing for me to say, because I believe in marriage. I believe that people should stay together. I believe in all the things that the Bible talks about. But this was I did not see a way that this would stop. So that's one of the situations. Another situation that I think it's very dangerous for us to build a stereotype over is that the kind of women who are abused are weak, and the kind of women and don't often have a voice. That isn't the case. The data is pretty clear that it cuts across all social classes, and you have some really go-getters, women who are at home abused and keep coming back to the abuse over and over again. They are smart, they're intelligent, they are well-read, they have great friends, but they put themselves in this situation. And some of them have written books and so on. So Rene, perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about that, the stereotypes and and how they make it difficult for people to share.
Well, in one of our studies, when we talked to women who had been abused in their relationship, we talked about what kinds of things they were thinking about at the time of their abuse. And one misbelief, false belief, was that Christian men do not abuse their spouses. Christian men will not abuse me, and my husband is a Christian, so therefore, I don't know what's happening to me. It can't be abuse. See, so that's kind of a stereotype that some of our women had in their heads, that it can't, and an Adventist wouldn't, especially an Adventist wouldn't abuse. So those early stereotypes do really figure into this whole situation.
How important, because we know when we talk about headship within a marriage, and I want to be clear that I'm not disparaging headship or that sort of idea of marriage, but when it's incorrectly exhibited to a child or to a teenager, and then they grow up to think that this is what headship is, because that's headship in itself is, or the idea of submitting to one another, wives submitting to your husbands, husbands love your wives. This idea, when put into practice, is actually a really equal way of being in a marriage. Like, we're submitting to each other, submit to each other out of reverence for God. I'm submitting to my husband, but he's loving me, so that doesn't mean any, so this idea is actually a very healthy way to be in a marriage. But when demonstrated incorrectly, right, to a young girl, that's where that confusion may come from, because then she doesn't understand she's being abused, or that headship is being used to manipulate her or to abuse her, or vice versa. And how important is, I would say, the correct, or like a healthy view of relationship. And I know we're not all blessed to see that. There are a lot of us in the world who don't get to see that. But how important is that to recognizing abuse in your own life, maybe, especially within these Christian settings?
Sam, do you want to take the first shot at that, or was that specifically for me?
Go for it, and I'll add a couple of comments if.
Okay. I think that our theology does lend itself, when used wrongly, to keep people in an abusive relationship longer. We value the marriage relationship more than we value the individual lives that are in that relationship. Sometimes it's okay to be hit, it's okay to be killed, as long as you stay married. But that's not what Jesus calls us to. As you mentioned, it's mutual submission. So submit to one another, and love each other as Jesus loved the church and gave his life for the church. So that's something that's wonderful and inviting and always safe. So if a relationship doesn't have that safety, then it's a problem.
Yeah.
Another phenomenon that I found really interesting is that as a pastor, before a couple divorces, they call the pastor. I don't know why they call the pastor. Maybe they want a blessing for the divorce, but they always call the pastor. They were thinking of separating and divorcing. And in my experience, the man loses the right to expect submission when they no longer love as Jesus loved. And it's very simple. In fact, that passage, I have studied it quite deeply. It does not tell the wife to love the husband.
Yeah, somebody was just saying that to me.
The husband loves first. Yeah, the wife responds to his love. And if you really want to get depressed, read 1 Corinthians 13, the chapter on love, because I love and hate that chapter all at the same time. Love is patient. Love is kind. It keeps no records of wrongs. I mean, the whole thing, every wedding that somebody decides that this is a great idea to read, I start getting annoyed, because that's the standard that I have to live up with first. As that's what headship, in my opinion, means, Jennifer, is that's the standard I as a husband have to live up to first. And as I describe this to now thousands and thousands of people, I have never met a woman who says, if I had that, I would not submit. It doesn't work that way. And I often put it this way: if your wife knows that without a shadow of a doubt, in the blink of an eye, you're willing to give your life for her, usually there is no insecurity there, and the marriage is a lot happier. So there is a reason why men are stronger. And you see this in boys and girls. Suddenly there are hits of testosterone in the boy, and their muscles just build, and men are usually stronger. There are some women that are stronger than many men, but on the whole, we just had the Olympics. You have a male race and you have a female race, because men are usually stronger within their muscles and so on. And the reason why God made that is the providing, the protecting, and all of the wonderful things that husbands can do. Abuse and using that strength to in any other negative way must be so grotesque to God, that I imagine how much suffering God goes through as that happens. It's not okay. It's not acceptable, and it has to end. And this is the hope that one day this will no longer happen on the new earth. And Seventh-day Adventists, in my opinion, are here to anticipate the new earth and try to do everything we can so that it doesn't happen now and here. And now I bring an important point, Jennifer, which is, hold on a minute. You have this message of hope and salvation, and the rates of abuse inside the church are the same as outside the church. What difference does it make? And to some degree, there is logic to it. But in another degree, this is absolutely senseless. Imagine, for example, that you have a toothpaste called White Smiles toothpaste, and it promises you that those who use it will have whiter smiles, right? And that is correct at an individual level. Let's say that it does work, that it's not just propaganda or marketing. Let's say that it does work. Is it reasonable to expect that somebody who has very bad teeth and uses the toothpaste will have better teeth than somebody who was blessed with great teeth that never decay and their genetics is wonderful? No, it is not reasonable to expect the same. Somebody who uses the product that is good will have worse teeth than somebody who doesn't even need the product in the first place. And therefore, the real measurement of Christianity and Seventh-day Adventism is in particular is, would this person be much worse if they did not believe what they believe? Are they getting better or worse? And now we have to see the humanity of the oppressor. I first encountered this deeply when I was in Northern Ireland doing a week of prayer, and somebody a foreigner to Northern Ireland, came to me afterwards and said, "Pastor, I need to talk to you." This was a 20-something-year-old man who cried for the 2 hours that we talked. In between the tears, he managed to explain to me that he could not control his desire for intimacy with children. Think about that for a moment. I have in front of me what most societies would consider to be a monster. But the monster is sitting in front of me, and Jesus died for the monster, and he sees himself as a monster. And the only solution he can think of is suicide. There is a humanity in the oppressor. And of course, he was abused. And when he was a teenager, older boys abused him. And the machinery, the wretched machinery, as C.S. Lewis puts it, God knows the wretched machinery that he's driving. So from that moment on, throughout that week, I mentioned that I would mention this to the local pastor, and that only the elders would know that this is what he struggled with. And every Sabbath, every time he would come to the church, one of the elders would be with him at all times. And he was very happy with that. And there is freedom when you share the inner evil that lives within you that God hasn't healed yet. Because to the oppressors, you're not alone either. You don't have to journey through this alone. If you're listening to this, and now I want to talk to you that is listening, if you're listening to this and you have violent tendencies, and you have been known, and you know that you have physically and verbally abused the people that love you and that you love, then share this with somebody you trust, and together become accountable so that this won't happen again. And if what you are tempted to do and what the evil within you is much worse than that, then definitely seek help. Obviously, if you're listening to this and you're a victim, we've already made it really clear, seek help. And I'm sure there will be a good number in that you can see here in websites that you can access, because you don't have to go through this alone either. But there is a humanity both to the victim, which is obvious, but also to the oppressor. And God has died for both and is suffering to heal both.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, to remember that we are each children of God. He died for each of us. That when we look at each other, we need to remember that other person is also a child of God. I wanted to talk really quick about the stereotype, Sam, that you were talking about, especially about strong women. Because I think what happens is that people say she would never be abused, right? Like she would never let that happen. Rene, I wonder if you can speak to this a little bit, because what I have seen is abuse happening gradually in those instances. So somebody talks badly, they yell at the person, or every time they forget the phone, maybe in the car, they're uncontactable, then there's an argument. And then that progresses to this, and that progresses to that, until there is abuse. There is a situation of abuse, and the woman doesn't necessarily know how she got there, because it's not the person she was. Sorry, I just lost my earbud. She's not the person she was. She's not the person who she started out to be, but because that abuse was so gradual, and because it started with just an argument or a little bit of controlling behavior, a little bit of jealousy, which, by the way, we think, oh, well, isn't that romantic? He cares about who I'm talking to. He's a little bit jealous. Isn't that sweet? Then suddenly you're in a situation where there is abuse, maybe not physical, but verbal, maybe physical. Is that something that you've seen, Rene, or that you can speak to?
So you've talked about a couple of different indicators that you're in an abusive situation. What you talked about last was jealousy,
Mm-hmm.
and a little bit of, oh, you're mine, and I don't want anybody else talking to you. A little bit of possessiveness is one thing, but overly possessive, that is an indicator of abuse. And a person needs to be a person in their own right. So they need to be able to make their own decisions, decide what's right and wrong for themselves. And what we saw in our studies was that the spouses would want to make theological decisions. I will be the person that you need to come to tell you what's right and wrong. And you don't make your own decisions about right and wrong. You will not wear pants. You will not watch TV. You will not listen to this kind of music or that kind of music. And that's how we're going to run this household. And those are the things that are right, and those are the things that are wrong, because God is talking to me. And so anytime that there is that kind of controlling behavior, and the jealousy fits into that scope of behavior as well, then the person isn't making their own decisions, and they aren't being their own person. And that, I believe, is not what God wants for us.
Yeah. Rene, we've talked about this at the beginning, that we have End It Now Sabbath coming up on August 28th. The church does provide year-long resources on their different websites. If you live in North America, End It Now, NorthAmerica.org. If you live globally, it's enditnow.org. So there are resources in those places. But generally speaking, I know we've talked about this, that we need to make this more of a priority throughout the year. We can't wait to the fourth Sabbath of August to talk about this if we want to make a change. It has to be something that we do regularly. What are some of the things that we can do to talk about this regularly? What are some of the things that you go into local churches, you've done presentations, you've done seminars. What can local churches do to sort of bring this up more regularly, so that if there is abuse happening within the four walls of the church, that women know where to go, that men know where to go, that the children, know where to go, because we haven't talked about child abuse, and goodness, that is something we could have a whole conversation about, just abuse with children. And so what resources can a church have besides just the number? How can we bring it up? How can we talk about this more fluidly as a denomination, as local churches?
Well, some things that we recommend is for churches to, of course, observe Abuse Prevention Day, because then at least it brings it up in front of the congregation once a year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Whereas in North America, that seems to happen less and less. The worldwide church has more of an observation, at least anecdotally.
Mm-hmm.
So observe that Sabbath by having a special program that day that highlights the realities of our church. And then follow that up with targeted educational efforts by whoever is willing to get those kind of educational inputs. That you can go on the web. There are trainings already that are free and that you can tap into. And get known then as an abuse expert, if you will, or someone who knows something about abuse, and will not say, "Oh, you've got to be kidding," after someone discloses, that will say, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that," and here's the number. So educate yourselves about the resources that are around you, that are available online, and that you can tap into, and make sure that there are people that are known. And you can do that by putting it in that name and number in the bulletin or in a church newsletter. So whoever is willing to take the call.
Rene, my sister is a teacher, and I know that teachers are trained to look out for child abuse, right? That's something that they're trained to do. They watch for child abuse. Are pastors and ministry leaders taught in the same way to look out for abuse in their congregation? And if they are, how should they, if you, Sam, and maybe you can speak to this, I would like to hear from both of you. If I'm a ministry leader in my local church, or if I'm a pastor and I suspect someone in my congregation, either a male or female, is being abused, what do I do? Do I talk to them directly? Do I consult with my elders? I mean, because Sam, when you talk to that pastor who was the abuser, you took your elders. If I'm being abused, I don't want you to bring like a council of churches to me that I might not be willing to open up to you. Especially if either way, if I'm a woman, I don't want to be surrounded by male elders asking me if I'm being abused. And I can't speak to this personally, but I would imagine if I was a male being abused, I wouldn't want my friends and colleagues surrounding me asking me. So, Rene, and then Sam, what would you tell me? How would you recommend we approach this if we feel like someone in our congregation may be being abused?
And they don't approach you first?
Yes. Do you leave it alone?
Just very, very cautiously be a friend. One person was helped a lot by a friend that they just went walking together. They lived in the same neighborhood and were church members together, and she just said, well, let's walk together. I see you walking every once in a while. Let's make it at 8:30 in the morning. And so they started walking together. And then one day, the neighbor noticed some bruises on the woman's wrists. And that's where her husband had tied her down to rape her. And she noticed it, and she just said, wow, how did you get those? And it was just the right timing. There would have been some times in this woman's life when she would have said, oh, nothing. I don't really even know how it happened. But by that time, she was ready, and she said, actually, it was my husband. And that friend, that neighbor, said, here's some things that we can do. And she knew of a shelter, an Adventist shelter, that she could go to. And she knew of a Christian counselor who specialized in this area. And so she was able to get this woman some counseling. And so being ready and being gentle, I think those are the two things that are the most important.
Being prayerful.
Yes.
Because praying your way through that situation and praying for the person, because God obviously opened up the right time. You talked about the timing was perfect. So being prayerful in that situation, that God will lead you in your words and your actions. Sorry, Sam.
I think Rene is spot on. If somebody's being abused, they're waiting to tell somebody at some point that they know something is wrong. They all know something is wrong. They don't know what to do about it, but they all know something is wrong. Sometimes they're children to contend with, and what will happen. And they play those scenarios in their head for a very long time. So if sometimes the Holy Spirit whispers that maybe you need to get close to this person, as God finding a way to take them away from that situation. So become a good friend, invite them over, and so on and so forth. Usually, if there is abuse in a home, the abuser will not want exposure to other people that brings closeness to the family. They will try and protect the spouse from being intimate with anybody, because they know, the oppressor now knows, that if their intimate relationship, let's say a spouse, but it could be a teenage son or daughter, for example, if they become too close to another family, the chances are that their abuse will come out into the open. And so they try to keep everything as close to only their family as possible. But you can't do that and live. So, you being a good friend means trying to expose yourself as much as possible to build trust enough that they will share. And when they do share, the example Rene gave is brilliant. Don't ask leading questions.
Mm-hmm.
This is an important part, I think, of that process, especially with children and teens. Leading questions are just about the worst thing you could ask when you're having that difficult conversation. If they shared something with you, you go, instead of asking, and so did they touch you anywhere? You see that whole body language of coming close and doing this, especially children and sometimes teens. They expect me to say yes, and in an inappropriate place. That's the expectation that is perceived by the person telling the story, which is not helpful. So, what happened? Tell me more. These open-ended questions, let them speak, and so on. I wanted to bring up in this as well another aspect of how positive a local community could be. Inviting others for lunch and having a lot of time between families brings a lot of healing that is unspoken. So my grandmother, I'll give you this as an example. My grandmother had my mom from a teenage, not quite, she wasn't a teenager, but it was a out of wedlock. My mother was an out of wedlock child. My grandfather was a Muslim tradesman. My grandmother, a Catholic Italian woman, they kind of had an affair, a relationship, and she became pregnant. My grandmother's family kicked her out of the house, and now she was by herself, having to have this child. Then she met this widower who was willing to marry her because he had children and didn't know what to do with the children. So she got married to him. Turns out he was a drunkard who beat her up for 30 years. And nobody knew about it. Eventually, he died. And then my grandmother started talking about it. His father did the same before that. And what you see often is people that are in such abusive environments that they think it's normal. And they bring that up to the new generation. And when you spend time with other families, something that happens that is amazing is that there is a lot of learning that happens. Men that are often violent become less violent when they see other men treat their wives properly, even in difficult situations. And we start learning from each other, especially people that are in an abusive relationship who think it's normal, realize that it's not. That is also an interesting thing that happens. It's like, okay, I never see so-and-so. This never happens to them. And of course, I'm describing families that have generations of issues. And this is naturally exposed, even without conversations, just by spending time together among other families. So that's the positive nature of church, is that we are close enough to each other that we can help each other just by example. Just by being in an environment with a healthy family can bring a lot of healing. So that's something else that is positive about it.
That's a good point. I know we need to wrap up, but I will say, Rene, you kind of convinced me. I think that even on ANN in depth, Sam, we will talk about this more than once a year. We'll try to make this a quarterly conversation, not just about abuse between spouses, but children. And this year, the theme for End It Now is child abuse or childhood violence and pornography. We have done an episode on pornography and the dangers of pornography, which was eye-opening. We talked about how dangerous it is and how young children are watching pornography. So we will start talking about this more, and hopefully if we start talking about it more, then people who are watching will start educating themselves a little bit better on the topic, because I think that, the best way, I think when Sam, you talked about this with your story, that the best way to end something is to bring it to the light. Nothing, we've talked about this in several episodes. We talked about this in our episodes on forgiveness. You can't forgive something that you're not willing to acknowledge. You can't end something that you're not willing to admit happens. So if we're not willing to talk about abuse, how can we have any hope of ending it? So we'll talk more about this in the coming months and years, or however long the Lord decides that we will continue this program. Who knows? It might not be that long, depending on what we say here. But I think that, Rene, you've convinced me that the conversation needs to continue, and that's the best way to help the problem right now. Rene, are there any places, if I'm watching this, and I know that you work mainly in North America, but if I'm watching this and I'm a pastor in North America, are there places that I can go to get resources or to get training for this?
There aren't any official places that I'm aware of. I worked at Southern for several years, and at that time we had a team of people that would train. Now I'm at the University of Southern Mississippi. So as far as I know, there aren't any official outlets for training. But if someone would want to contact me, I could connect you with some people who know some things and could make a training happen. So I guess that's my best advice.
All right. Well, and we have your email address, or your website, which has a way to contact you on there. So that's great. Rene, we do need to wrap up. I know we've had you here an hour, and we're so grateful for that. But could you pray for us and for the families and the people who are watching right now?
I will. Thank you. I will. Loving Lord, when we think about your great love for us and the ways that you've taken care of us, we also think of your great sacrifice. And when Jesus, just before he died, he was so abused and used so that we would not need to be abused. And we remember that Jesus said that he came to give us life and to give it more abundantly. So we pray for all the folks, the families, the women, the men who are in abusive situations right now. And we know that you want to give them life abundantly, and that an abusive life is not abundant living. So we pray that you will help them find their way to help and healing, and give us all an inspiration to serve you more and better in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Rene, for your wonderful advice and for the research that you've done and the help that you've given thousands of men and women. We appreciate it very much. Sam, as always, thank you. If you're watching this and you're being abused, or like Sam said, you're abusing, reach out into your community and see where you can get help. Don't let it continue to happen, because you are a child of God and he loves you and he died for you, and he doesn't want you to be treated badly. He wants you to live a life more free and abundantly. So make sure that you're reaching out to those who can help you. Don't forget that we have a team willing to pray for you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so let us know how we can pray for you this week. Talk to you later. Bye.